and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we are taking a look at some cars from the rest of Europe, which is a catchy title. However, there wasn't enough in each country to make a full episode, so here's what you get. First up, we have the 2016 Jaguar F-Type Project 7, 567 horsepower, 516 foot-pound torque, 3,571 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, the torquiest car here today, and the heaviest car here today. I do love the Jaguar F-Type, and the Project 7 is a very special F-Type. This is essentially a track-focused, hardcore-ish version of the F-Type made to emulate the old Jaguar D-Type and some of their 50s Le Mans efforts, which were also legendary cars. I love the way it looks, I like the livery. I'm not a huge fan of the hump on the rear end. I get why it's there, but I wish they would have sort of done it on both so it wasn't asymmetrical. But regardless, it has a very cool livery and it has a wing, which means it's cool. As far as it goes to drive, it is a very, very solid bruiser, this one. I say it's a bruiser. It feels heavy, it feels very muscular, it feels very muscle car-esque, but overall it drives like an improved F-Type, which is sort of what you'd expect. It is a little bit more handling focused than the F-Type, which isn't necessarily a very handling focused vehicle, it has to be said. Still, it's not going to like burn off a Lotus Elise around a track or anything like that. It isn't a massive handling car, definitely still feels heavy, but yeah, not a bad vehicle to drive, all things considered. Next up, we have the 2005 Tvr Cigars, 406 horsepower, 349 foot-pound torque, 2,377 pounds of weight, a very, very light British sports car. Unfortunately, this is one of the only TVRs we have available to us here in Forza Motorsport 7, which I think is a damn shame because TVR has made some excellent vehicles. However, don't get me wrong, the Cigars is one of them. Essentially, this is an evolution of their old T350C vehicle that they had, which wasn't all that mental, and then when the Russians took over the company, they made it mental. It just, I mean, you can get it from the way it looks, from the weird wing to the slashes down the bonnet. This thing is all mental, powered by a Speed 6 engine, which has also been slightly boosted. As far as the Cigars goes to drive, well, it drives like you'd expect a TVR too. It is very, very light. That is one thing that's definitely worth mentioning. However, it doesn't try to kill you quite as much as maybe you'd expect it to. It's actually a pretty good car to drive. Sure, it's not one for the faint of heart, and much like a lot of the lightweight British sports cars, it is a bit harder to drive, but if you get it all right, this is a seriously quick car, even by today's standards, despite the fact it's 15 years old now. The Cigars can really mix it up with the best of them, and I like it a lot. Next up, we have the 2013 KTM Expo R, 295 horsepower, 295 foot-pound torque, 1,786 pounds of weight. The KTM has a special place in my heart for Forza Top Gear laps because this car has always done incredibly well, despite its PI. Don't get me wrong, it is a track toy, which obviously you'd expect it to do well. However, the one thing I like about the KTM and admire about it is, unlike some of the track toys in this game, say the Ariel Atom or the Lotus 311 that are absolutely mental to drive, the KTM is more peaceful. It's an easier track toy to drive. This is definitely if you're looking for one of these sort of track cars to get into, but you find the other ones way too difficult to drive. I can't help but recommend the KTM Expo as your first one. As a car overall, in the real world, I'm not all that much a fan of the KTM Expo. It's a track special, that's a little bit ridiculous. I prefer either the slightly more mental ones or the slightly more reserved ones, but regardless, in Forza, it is just a fantastic car to drive, really very good. As I said, if you want a track toy, if you're not really comfortable with driving these cars, even me who doesn't particularly like driving them, the KTM is definitely the one I'd go for. Either this or the Lotus 211, both of them are excellent. Speaking of Lotuses, we have the 2000 Lotus 340R. 177 horsepower, 126 foot-pound torque, 1,485 pounds of weight. This is almost the lightest car here today, however not quite, but it's beaten by something that's coming next. The Lotus 340R, a car that was sort of very scarce in video games until it returned into Horizon 3. Previously it was in PGR, I believe, but never really showed up anywhere after that. Essentially what it is a modified Elise. Think of it as the old school 211, I guess is the best way to think about it. I quite like it, because it looks very weird, and it also has the bluest interior you'll ever see. Seriously, drive this thing in cockpit mode, it is a very bluish purple place to be. As far as it goes to drive in Forza, I can't say I've ever really driven this thing in anger. However, after doing it today, I can safely confirm that this car is incredibly awkward to drive. It has the biggest example of lift-off oversteer I've ever seen in a car. This thing is very, very hard to drive. I definitely would not recommend it. And on top of that, sure, it's quick-ish around the corners, but it isn't lightning fast like you'd say a Lotus 311 is once you get it in check, so there's not really much reward for getting the 340R right. Overall, the 340R is a bit of a disappointment. You can see around there, yeah, just the lift-off oversteer is just insane in this thing. I'd much rather recommend this. The 1999 Lotus Elise Sport 190, 190 horsepower, 140 foot-pound torque, 1,477 pounds of weight. This is the lightest car here today by a whole 8 pounds over the Lotus 340R. Although it is kind of funny that the lighter of the two Lotuses would actually be the proper Elise as opposed to the more stripped out 340R. Admittedly, I believe this is based on the earlier Elise Series 1 as opposed to 340R, which I believe is a Series 2 car, but regardless, that's still kind of funny. Of course, this is the most ultimate version of the Elise, if of course you don't count the GT1 or the Motorsports Elise, so this is the ultimate in road legal Elises. Although that being said, it also has a track cut-off valve, so I don't quite know how road legal the Sport 190 is. Regardless, to drive, it is much less awkward than the 340R. It's definitely not an easy car to drive though. Forza's sort of taught us, as much as Lotuses are excellent handling cars and can run right around the track, they aren't the easiest things in the world to control, and you certainly need to have your wits about you. And this one, yeah, it's less awkward than the 340R, don't get me wrong, and it can be a lot quicker than the 340R if you get it right. But for me personally, yeah, it's still not an amazingly good car to drive. Next up, moving out of British and Austrian cars into French cars, we have the 2003 Renault Clio V6, 251 horsepower, 221 foot-pound torque, 3,086 pounds of weight. This car is still legendary because Renault went completely mad. They said, hey, you know that Clio Sport 182 we had, what if we made it more mental by not making it a front-wheel drive car with a 2-litre inline-4? How about we stick a giant V6 from, I believe, a Peugeot 406 in the middle, make it rear-wheel drive and call it a day, and that's what they did. This thing is just crazy. Also, I should quickly mention this livery. I can't quite remember what the hell this was for. I believe I was running in a Clio Cup series a while ago, or was supposed to, and I have this livery left over, so yeah, if you like it, let us know, because I think it's supposed to be inspired by the Momo Corsa MR2 for some reason. I quite like it, so I figured I'd leave it on. As far as the Clio V6 goes to drive in-game, it is actually, well, it does drive pretty much as I've heard it drives in real life, specifically this Series 2. The Series 1 Clio V6 had a awkward ability to have just snap oversteer because it was such a small wheelbase. The TWR took over the tuning for the Series 2 and they combated that by making it incredibly understeery. It isn't quite incredibly understeer in game, however there's definitely some understeer there. I quite like understeer, so I think it's a good car to drive, but your experience may differ on that one. Next up, another mid-engined French rocket, the 1984 Peugeot 205 T16, 200 brake horsepower, 188 foot-pound torque, 2,524 pounds of weight. While the Clio V6 was made for fun, the 205 T16 was made for serious Group B racing, and this thing would dominate Group B rallying. I believe it won 2 manufacturers' titles and a couple of drivers' titles as well to boot. The 205 T16 was one of the cars to have in Group B rallying, and of course because it's Group B they did have to make 200 road versions. This is such a car. Unfortunately, like a lot of the Group B road versions, this is rather detuned to just 200 brake horsepower, but that still makes it pretty cool. And yeah, the 205 T16 is a car I liked, and of course when Group B got banned they just turned this thing towards hill climb, and it did amazingly well in that as well. As far as it goes to drive in Forza, this is a fun car to drive because it likes to rotate. It likes the rear end to come out. I went into the first corner on my first lap and literally drifted the entire thing. It is a crazy amount of fun to just throw this thing into corners and watch it drift. If you want to drive it seriously, it's a little bit harder, but yeah, it's a fun car to drive, rotates. The only issue it really has is the long gear ratios, which I wasn't expecting, but it can do 60 miles an hour in first gear, which is weird for a car like this, but yeah, give the 205 T16 a go, because it is just an incredible amount of fun to watch this thing rotate into corners. And finally today, another French rallying legend, the 1973 Alpine A110, 123 horsepower, 106 foot-pound torque, 1,576 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful car here today, and the least torquey car here today. The little Alpine A110. I have got to admit, I don't remember if this car was made specifically for rallying, but I do remember it being pretty darn successful for rallying, and it really opened certain manufacturers' eyes up to the idea of these sort of cars, like Lancia would with the Stratos, the mid-engined rear-drive car that was fully built for rallying. This thing is rear-engined, rear-wheel drive, a cute little French sports car. Of course, there is now a revitalised version of this with sort of the retro Nouvelle styling. Unfortunately, we don't have that version in Forza. That's more of a Cayman rival. This was more in a league of its own, I guess, but it'll be interesting to see how it does against some of the other cars of its period. As far as it goes to drive, it is a great car to drive, the Alpine. I never really expected much less from this thing. Admittedly, it is rear-engine, rear-wheel drive, so there was the chance of oversteer, but it hasn't really got all that much power in order to push it there. It is a little bit soft, the brakes aren't quite as good as you'd expect from a car as light as this, but it is a great car to drive. That being said, I would definitely put some upgrades into this if I was driving it, because I can feel that while 123 horsepower isn't a lot, you can definitely feel like the chassis is limited. So if you are going to tune this car, definitely make sure to upgrade the suspension, brakes and stick a roll cage in it. But it is actually a pretty darn good car to drive. Onto the times then, and the KTM Expo, unsurprisingly, was the fastest car today, going 68th place with a 1:15.798, puts it in between a Ferrari 599 GTO and an Acura NSX. I told you this thing was quick. It's quicker than a Lotus Elise GT1 as well, which is a fantastic handling car, and actually higher PI as well. In 106th place, we find the Tvr Cigars with a 1:18.552, goes slightly slower than a Porsche 959. Just underneath that is the Jaguar F-Type Project 7 with a 1:18.571, beats out the equally as mental SL65 AMG Black, beats out an Aston Martin DB11, Shelby GT350R, Camaro ZL1. It's right up there with those sort of track special American muscle cars, which is kind of where you'd expect it to be, really. Moving down once again, in 156th place, we find the Lotus Elise Sport 190 with a 1:20.996. Interestingly, just beats out the also Lotus-tuned Corvette ZR1 of the time, beats out a Lotus Esprit V8 as well, which is pretty darn impressive, only misses out slightly on a BMW i8. Down in 170th place, we find the Lotus 340R with a 1:21.639, slightly slower than a Bentley Continental GT, which is pretty impressive. It's actually quicker than a Lotus Evora as well, but that car is just very tricky to drive. It was running 122s, but the final lap pushed it over the edge, if I remember correctly. Moving down once again, we find the Peugeot 205 T16 in 355th place with 1:27.832, and just underneath that is the Renault Clio V6 going into 336th place with a 1:27.913. Beats out both of them an Audi S1, which is an all-wheel drive modern day hot hatch. Beats out a Ford Focus RS, Volkswagen Golf R32. Both of those cars do pretty darn well, especially the 205 considering its age. And finally today, in 459th place, we find the Alpine A110 with a 1:33.114. It is very slightly slower than a Renault Clio Williams, which is pretty impressive. But other than that, it is quicker than, say, a Ford Focus RS 1600, RS 1800, the Opel Kadett, some of its rivals from that time. So thank you all very much for watching this edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. Do hope you've enjoyed. Next time for the main episode, we're going to be taking a look at the two-parter ender to this series as we take a look at some of the last cars we have to run. And then join us next time on Rivals as we're going to be taking a look at a Nissan Old versus New Clash. So do hope you join us for that. Thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, a farewell.
You know what I feel. The sorrow that my heart holds in knowing just where my hopes and dreams are going. I'll only lay up in a wall that you are not part of. Eyes on the slit of your father with love.